Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 11 lecture. So today we stay in the year 1994 and we visit Clerks, written and directed by Kevin Smith. So much like Pulp Fiction, Clerks has a pretty outsized cultural impact, and we are going to talk about that a little bit today. It's an influential film in a lot of ways. It influenced future filmmakers, certainly, but we can also see, I think, how Smith kind of falls into this lineage that we've been tracking a little bit in this class. I think he definitely takes some inspiration from Jim Jarmusch in terms of visual style. He's also influenced by Spike Lee and Do the Right Thing. I believe we mentioned that back when we were talking about Do the Right Thing, because Smith has mentioned that on several occasions that he was inspired by this sort of day in the life structure. He liked that neat, tidy, sort of self-contained structure, and of course he uses that in his own screenplay here for Clerks. So we can see some of the ways that he has been influenced by some of the previous filmmakers that we've studied, and also much like we did with Tarantino, we can probably track some of the influences that he continues to have on contemporary film. Although I do think the aging process has gone differently for Pulp Fiction, maybe compared to Clerks. Clerks remains a cult film. It remains popular among many. It remains beloved among many. But in my own personal opinion, it hasn't aged quite as well as Pulp Fiction, and there's probably some different reasons for that, but perhaps the most obvious reason is that while Pulp Fiction is, as we talked about last week, really not rooted to realism in any way, it's really a film that exists in a purely sort of fictive universe built out of pre-existing movies and books and all kinds of older Pulp Fiction, which kind of gives the movie a timeless quality. While Pulp Fiction is that way, Clerks is very much rooted to a specific time and place, and it does achieve a high level of realism, but for some of those reasons, some of those very reasons that made it popular when it first came out, some of the reasons why it resonated with a big audience might also be some of the reasons why the film feels a bit dated now. It might feel outdated in terms of some of the attitudes we see on display, the language that's used by the characters. And I do have to offer a disclaimer here. I said it in the module, so I assume that by the time you're coming here to watch the lecture, you've already seen the film. But I do apologize for the pervasive, explicit language that permeates the entire film, as you guys have probably already experienced, or you may have already heard of it if you haven't seen the film yet. It's kind of infamous for its very explicit sexual themed language, a lot of, very explicit sex talk. A lot of people find it offensive. A lot of people find it kind of tasteless or maybe in bad taste. And we can certainly have that conversation. If any of you feel that way, if you feel like maybe the film crosses the line in some ways in its use of language, we can certainly talk about that. I asked that question, a similar question, about the offensive language in Pulp Fiction, and reading through your discussion posts, a lot of you seem to think that within the context that Tarantino was creating, within the kind of fictive universe of Pulp Fiction, the language and even the violence and some other offensive aspects sort of seemed to fit. They seem to make sense. They seem logical, with the possible exception of the use of the N-word, which was a little bit more acceptable in the mid-90s and more acceptable in the mouths of white characters, which some of you pointed out, a little bit more acceptable back then than it would be now in 2022. So we noted that difference, but otherwise we seemed by and large pretty comfortable with Tarantino's language and violence because we felt like it all fit into the milieu that he was portraying and the overall fictive universe that he was creating. So we might feel the same way about the language in Clerks. We might feel like it fits the time and place, it fits the characters. And while it is offensive and shocking at times, maybe that's by design. Maybe it's part of characterization when we're talking about Dante and Randall, particularly Randall, who's the guilty party for the most part. So maybe it fits into this particular milieu, this particular setting that Smith is working with, and these particular characters. So we can talk about that more. We'll have a chance to talk about it on the discussion board as usual, but yeah, we can decide if Clerks has aged as well as we thought Pulp Fiction aged. Maybe in some ways, yes. Perhaps in other ways, no. But again, the cultural significance here is pretty important to kind of foreground. We talked about the significance of Pulp Fiction as well, and a lot of you pointed out movies and shows, the contemporary movies and shows that seem to be influenced by Tarantino's violence, his writing, his style, and we might be able to do something similar with Smith, kind of like I said earlier, tracking some of his ongoing, some of the influences from him that are still ongoing that we can still see today. But especially when this movie came out, in '94, I think it resonated with a lot of people. It resonated with a lot of younger suburban viewers, perhaps. I don't want to say the audience was overwhelmingly male, but certainly a lot of young suburban white men in the mid to late 90s liked this movie a lot. I can speak a little bit from experience here. I don't want to talk too much about myself, but this movie, along with Pulp Fiction, were very important to my circle of friends, my sort of social group in the late 90s. And one thing to point out, Pulp Fiction has a lot of resonance too, but what made Clerks sort of unique is the fact that Smith was capturing characters and settings that didn't necessarily appear very often in film, at least not mainstream film. So there was a review right when the movie came out. Roger Ebert wrote a pretty famous review of Clerks, and he started the review by saying, in a lot of movies, nobody seems to work. Nobody seems to have jobs outside of maybe cop, drug dealer. I can't remember the exact quote, but he's like, the only jobs we see in a lot of big mainstream Hollywood movies would be, cops, drug dealers, maybe, space captains. We don't see a lot of mundane, everyday jobs depicted. Which was true. And that was how he was sort of establishing Clerks as being different, inventive, kind of a fresh voice. That's how a lot of people viewed Kevin Smith at the time because, we're in a convenience store in sort of suburban New Jersey. There's nothing very exciting happening here. This is not a glamorous setting, so we are far removed from gangsters in New York City or Los Angeles or, the kind of glossy, high-profile settings that we might expect to find in a lot of mainstream films. And again, the jobs on display here, a convenience store clerk and his friend who works at the neighboring video store. We didn't typically see jobs like that on screen. If we were going to see jobs depicted, like Ebert said, they tended to be sort of glamorous or exciting, maybe like an international correspondent in a war zone or like some high-ranking business or political leader, but not jobs like this. And not typically would we see people like this, like Dante, like Randall, sort of, adrift, young sort of slacker types. We've already seen, though, that in the indie film world, this template had kind of already been established. Jarmusch, I think, contributes, again, we'll talk about the ways he influences Smith, but in terms of the characters and the kind of marginalized lifestyles, we might see some precedents in Jarmusch, but I think more clearly we can see those precedents with Richard Linklater. Of course, we watched Dazed and Confused, but we also talked a little bit about his first film, Slacker, which kind of got him on the map, and it is somewhat similar in terms of subject matter, in terms of its kind of loose structure, if we're comparing it to Clerks. And Smith has talked about some of the ways that that film influenced him as well. So there had been independent films depicting sort of young slacker types working dead-end jobs, mostly just sitting around and talking. We had already seen a little bit of that in the indie world, but movies like Stranger Than Paradise and Slacker, they didn't quite cross over into what we might think of as mainstream pop culture in the same way that Clerks did. And to me, that's what makes Clerks a little bit more of a powerful sort of movement film in some ways, if that makes sense. It had a little bit more of an outsized impact on viewers when it came out. And again, just thinking about my own experiences, when my friends and I watched the film, we're 14, 15, 16 years old. We didn't see it when it first came out. I was a little young in 94, but about 3 or 4 years later, we were watching it, appropriately enough, on home video, watching it at our houses on VHS. We went up to the video store, checked it out, probably needed our parents to accompany us because it was rated R. And when we watched the movie, I think we were really struck by how familiar a lot of what we saw seemed. Again, we were used to watching these big glossy Hollywood movies that didn't seem anything like our lives. They didn't seem anything like the place where we lived or the people that we knew. And so when we watched Clerks and we looked at Dante and Randall, we kind of felt like we might know guys similar to that. We went to school with guys who kind of reminded us of Dante and Randall. Even the setting, we're in, again, suburban New Jersey, like Asbury Park, which is where Bruce Springsteen's from, Monmouth County. That's where Kevin Smith himself is from. So that's his home area. He knows it well, and he set all of his early films, all of his 90s films are primarily set in New Jersey. So, I grew up in South Carolina, but we were in a sort of similar type of suburban community, not rural, but certainly not a big city. So again, we talked about this a little bit with Linklater as well in Dazed and Confused, but I just remember watching the movie and it just looked familiar. The strip malls, the residential neighborhoods. I can remember that scene when they're playing hockey up on the convenience store roof, and you can kind of see neighboring areas, some trees, some wooded areas. It looked a lot like where my friends and I grew up. It looked a lot like our own hometown. And those were the kinds of businesses that we had in our hometowns. Lots of convenience stores, video rental stores, residential areas, low-rise business districts, nothing very big, nothing very exciting. We were kind of close to big cities, like they're kind of close to New York City, but it's not the big city. It's a different kind of environment. It's quiet. Not a whole lot happens. So it all felt very familiar to us. As young people, we would walk up to the neighboring convenience store before we could drive. We would go up there to buy Slurpees and sodas and candy and guitar magazines. And we would see guys, older guys, sort of burnout, high schoolers, a little bit like Jay and Silent Bob, hanging out in front of the store, smoking cigarettes, sort of just talking junk to people. So it all felt real. It felt familiar, it felt current and vital, and it felt very realistic. We could relate to the characters, we could relate to the setting, and obviously we were younger, we didn't have these types of jobs yet ourselves, but we were able to relate to the subject matter, the characters, the setting, obviously the writing in general. So, and we were typical, I think, of a lot of the sort of cult following that assembled around this film throughout the 90s, because it didn't play in theaters for very long. It didn't play in many theaters. Also, Miramax did not give it a huge theatrical release. So it made a lot of its money a little later on through home video. and a lot of people like us experienced it for the first time on home video. So I loved the movie when I was 15. I've revisited it a few times as an adult, and it's sort of been a story of diminishing returns. I still think the movie is important. I think it plays an important cultural role. I think it says a lot, like a lot of great works of art, it says a lot about the time and place in which it was produced. This movie is an interesting sort of time capsule of the mid-90s, the way people dressed, sort of the culture as it existed at that particular time in this kind of a place, suburban, north or central New Jersey. So it's important for all of those ways, but for all of those reasons. But just thinking about it aesthetically, I don't enjoy it quite as much as I did as a teenager. And that's natural enough. But again, I want us to decide if the humor holds up. Does the humor age well? Because the film, when it first came out, was thought of as very funny. And Smith has, of course, made a career out of largely being a comedy writer. That's how we think of him, although his career's taken some interesting turns. We can discuss that near the end of lecture, talk a little bit more about his larger filmography, but certainly when he first broke onto the scene, he was thought of as a funny comedy writer. That's how this movie was perceived and often reviewed when it first came out. It largely got good reviews, good critical reviews. A lot of critics referred to it as hilarious. I remember one review called it screamingly funny, uproariously funny, and I agreed back in high school. Now, there's still some laughs. I find parts of it funny. I don't find it as funny. So maybe that's just me getting older. Maybe the world has changed. I don't know. But we can certainly evaluate Smith in terms of aesthetics and how well the film has aged. And also, if we notice the turns his career has taken, I feel pretty comfortable saying that he hit his pinnacle as a filmmaker pretty early in his career, in the 90s. By the time he moved into the 2000s, the quality of his films kind of dropped. And we might ultimately decide that he deserves recognition as a writer, but maybe not quite as much as a director, because we might notice the visual style right away here. Let's kind of start with that. So obviously the film is photographed in black and white, so that might put us in mind of Stranger Than Paradise or even Go Fish, a much more recent film that we've watched. So as we know, in some low-budget independent productions, black and white was an appealing option because the film stock is cheaper than it would be in color. So it's just a way to save money and be economical. So we notice the black and white. We notice the sort of grittiness. It's sort of, again, not anything glamorous. There's no, glossy sheen here. We're in very mundane, everyday spaces. And we also might notice a lot of stationary camera shots in the early going. Now, we do get some camera movement at times, but especially early on, like when Dante is getting called into work, some of the early shots that we see as he arrives at work, we don't see the camera moving a lot. So again, that might put us in mind once again of Jarmusch in Stranger Than Paradise, because that's kind of his style. These sort of continuous, long-lasting shots where the camera does not move. But I would argue that Jarmusch and his cinematographer do a really nice job of framing a lot of these shots, and there are some well-timed and well-placed pans and movements. With Clerks, I don't know that we have a very distinguished visual style here, and a lot of reviewers commented on that at the time. But again, this is sort of part of the initial appeal. There's a real DIY ethos at work here, and the film was done. It was shot on a shoestring budget. roughly $27,000 to make this movie. So, and they also shot it primarily in the convenience store where Smith worked at the time. They could only film at night. So that's why he wrote in the plot point that the shutters were jammed and they couldn't open them up, because they were only allowed to shoot during the evenings when the store was closed. So like late night, the wee hours of the morning when the store was closed for business. So we have limited locations. We have non-professional actors. Obviously a shoestring budget. The black and white plays into that. And even the lack of camera movement plays into that a little bit. This is kind of at best, a semi-professional production. And that was charming to some people. Not everybody loved it, and you can still hear people to this day refer to it as kind of amateurish. The acting at times definitely is. But the visuals are simple, I would say competent for the most part, but nothing special, not particularly inventive or dynamic, but not so bad that they draw a lot of attention to themselves, just sort of competent, baseline, okay. But clearly the featured attraction here is the writing. Smith was primarily known at this point in his career, at the beginning of his career, and even probably now, primarily known as a writer. A clever, witty, funny writer who was known for sort of peppering his characters' dialogue with a lot of pop culture references, but also a lot of really crude language. And I do want to return to that just for a moment, because these are recurring features. These are kind of parts of his signature style, as it would come to be known. And with the films that he came out with after Clerks, Mallrats, Chasing Amy, and then Dogma all came out between 95 and 99. And he was using a lot of the same characters, a lot of the same settings, and obviously a lot of these same sort of stylistic signatures. And those movies were all well received and successful. And then, what he does in the 2000s, he kind of moves away a little bit from some of this original kind of source material. He continues to make sequels of Clerks and Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. He has gone back to the well, as a lot of filmmakers do when they have early success. But he's also kind of branched out and done some different genres. He's worked in some other areas. He writes for comic books, etc. But he's always been known, I think, first and foremost as a writer. So we need to evaluate the quality of this screenplay. So that doesn't just include the dialogue, but obviously we need to think about dialogue because this movie largely consists of dialogue. Smith himself has pointed out that there's really not much of a plot here. Not a whole lot happens. It's kind of a loosely assembled plot. There is sort of an arc, and some events happen, but largely we have characters sitting around talking. We have a lot of scenes with Dante and Randall talking. We have scenes with Dante talking to the women in his life. And then we have a lot of scenes with them interacting, featuring them interacting with customers. That's often played to comic effect. So we can evaluate the dialogue, but also we should just think about the characters here. The characters that Smith has created. So a lot of people have pointed out, and he's admitted this as well, that the character of Dante is kind of loosely based on Smith, who was a college dropout. He had gone to film school in Vancouver briefly, but he didn't last, and he came back home to New Jersey, and he did for a while work in a convenience store. So a lot of the Dante character is based on him, and then he's said to have based the Randall character on his real life best friend. So that's not terribly important for us, but we should think about these guys, again, as being sort of typical characters for this particular time and place. Mid-90s, suburban New Jersey. Again, if we're thinking about realism, a lot of people gave Smith a lot of credit for achieving a high level of realism. And some people even, again, went to the language and said, if you walk around Monmouth County, New Jersey, if you walk around some of these places, you're going to hear people talking like Jay, like Randall. It's not beyond the pale. Is it, sort of vulgar, crude language? Yes. But is it unrealistic to think that some of these types of characters would speak like that? No, it's actually very realistic. So we kind of have to keep that in mind. And is that why he inserts so much crudity? Is it for the sake of realism, or does he have other purposes? I mean, I think at times some of the crude language and some of the offensive behavior, especially on the part of Randall, it's supposed to be funny, right? I mean, within the film's universe, these things are funny. Randall is supposed to be a funny character with a dark and sort of biting, cynical sense of humor. And again, a lot of teenagers, a lot of young people, I think, responded to the Randall character in particular because of how awful he is to customers. And just his sort of, too cool for school, don't care vibe. He's kind of above it all. But interestingly enough, at the end of the film, when he and Dante are sort of having their, heart to heart, or he's sort of yelling at Dante and trying to get him to change, it's Randall who points out to Dante that Dante thinks that he's better than the typical customers who come into the store. I'm never sure how to take that particular exchange, because it makes me feel like that Randall is quite a hypocrite, because it seems like he's the one who acts very superior to a lot of the customers, whereas Dante, by and large, though he does get irritated at times, by and large, he seems to treat the customers with a decent level of respect. It's Randall who seems to think that all customers are stupid and awful, even if they're just sort of asking him the kinds of questions that a video store clerk would expect to get asked. So that's kind of what I mean about evaluating the humor, evaluating how well it holds up. Do we laugh when Randall reads off that list of obscene porn titles, while the woman is standing there with her child? Like, is that funny? It was certainly thought of as funny in '94 by a lot of viewers and a lot of, critics. But is it funny now? Is it funny today? Or does it just make us feel like Randall is, excuse my language for a moment, just sort of an asshole? And he is, I think. But does he remain likable somehow despite all of his bad behavior? Or do we just find him a little bit insufferable? Just from conversations I've had with friends and other film nerds in recent years, a lot of people have grown to find Dante and Randall a lot less likable than maybe they found the characters initially when first encountering the film back in the 90s. So I want you guys to think about that. Are they sympathetic characters? Are they compelling in any way? Or are they mostly frustrating, lazy, childish? A lot of their behavior might strike us as juvenile, but we should also keep in mind, as it is stated in the film, that both of them are 22 years old, so they're both very young. They haven't really found their direction in life. We know that Dante dropped out of college. His girlfriend wants him to go back. And even though Randall at one point claims that he's satisfied with his current station in life, I think we can kind of sense, at least by the end, that he's probably not. But these guys are stuck in ways that maybe we've seen before. Again, with Linklater, with Jarmusch, maybe we've seen other examples of characters who are kind of stuck in their sort of less than satisfactory everyday life. They don't love it. They're bored. They're looking for an escape, whether that means getting out of the small town where they've always been or breaking free from a sort of unrewarding routine. But for whatever reason, we sort of see them struggling to find purpose, to find direction. We saw that with Stranger Than Paradise. We saw a little bit of that, even though the characters were younger. We saw that in Dazed and Confused. So we're seeing that again with Randall and Dante. So that sense of ennui, kind of just being dissatisfied, cynical, kind of world weary, but also very provincial, right? There's a sense that these guys, they haven't really seen much of the world. They've spent most of their life in this sort of suburban outpost. They know everybody, right? They see people they went to high school with. Dante's still hung up on his ex-girlfriend from high school. So they haven't grown up. They're not finished developing and progressing. So maybe we should keep that in mind when we sort of evaluate the characters or decide if we like them at all. And then the plot, as much as there is one here, again, we can observe it as being very much a slice of life, a day in the life. Again, Smith kind of borrowing that structure from earlier filmmakers, but in Spike Lee's day, the day that we see depicted in Do the Right Thing, a lot happens. A lot of important, even tragic events happen. Here, once again, maybe a little bit more relatable for a lot of suburban teens in the 90s who probably had not witnessed a race riot, but they had probably walked up to the video store or the convenience store and had some sort of meaningless but perhaps amusing exchange with some weirdo standing outside the store. So again, just everyday stuff. Nothing kind of beyond the pale, nothing sensationalized really, except maybe what happens near the end with Caitlin, which again was used as another piece of evidence for some that this movie kind of lacks taste, if you know what I mean, like just sort of a lot of tasteless jokes and maybe even tasteless treatment of the women characters. And that's another thing we can consider. Smith, I think at the time, in the mid to late 90s, was often thought of, and maybe even today, he's still thought of as a relatively progressive voice. Somebody who kind of champions, left-leaning politics and typically writes pretty good roles for women characters in his films, although his leads are almost always men. That's pretty typical for a male director. But he's not often thought of, at least not to my knowledge, I don't think he's often been accused of rampant misogyny or mistreatment of any kind. But in this film, I'm always a little intrigued by how the two principal female characters function. So we have Veronica, who's the girlfriend of Dante, and she's often seen helping Dante, bailing him out of bad situations. He doesn't really seem to appreciate her, kind of takes her for granted for much of the film, because as we know, he's hung up on Caitlin, who makes an appearance late in the runtime. But it always strikes me when he's realizing that maybe Veronica is the one for him, and he's told by others like Randall, like Jay, in a pretty funny scene near the end, he's kind of reminded by these other characters that, hey, Veronica does a lot for you. She brings lasagna to you at work. Jay, my favorite part of Jay's sort of dialogue there is when he says, "Yeah, didn't I see her helping you change a tire one time?" So part of the humor is, once again, Dante's kind of inept, right? Dante is very ineffectual. He's lazy. He can't really do very much for himself, so he needs other people to kind of push him or make him do things, or maybe just do them for him. So that's kind of funny based on what we know about the character. But it's also interesting that that's largely how her value is measured, is based on the things that she does for Dante. She brings you food. She helps you out. She sprayed the fire extinguisher when the angry smokers were, throwing cigarettes at him early in the movie. That's the first time we see her. So, again, a lot of people thought, oh, she's kind of an ass-kicking, take charge character. She comes to Dante's aid. She helps him. And yeah, that's definitely part of her characterization, and we can definitely analyze that and talk more about that, and we might view that as a pretty positive portrayal. But I think she is sometimes the butt of jokes, although maybe all the characters are at various times. And again, she's kind of reduced, her value is kind of reduced to simply what she does for Dante. And the only time we hear Silent Bob speak in that aforementioned scene where he and Jay come into the store right before they close, it's the last time we see the two of them. And the only time we hear Silent Bob speak, of course, Silent Bob is played by Kevin Smith. The only thing we hear him say in the entire film is basically, this girl does a lot for you and other attractive women will just cheat on you. Which again is kind of a through line. That's a little bit of a trope that runs through the film, this idea of female infidelity. Caitlin apparently is guilty of it multiple times, and then even Veronica is kind of shamed, at least briefly, by Dante for her previous sexual experiences, even though they predate Dante. So I don't know. I think in the present day, a little bit of the sexual politics here, they might feel a little outdated, but you guys can decide for yourselves. And again, Dante and Randall, with the language that they use and the way they sort of trivialize or maybe sort of reduce women to their body parts or their sort of, what they can do for us, that rubs some people the wrong way. But again, they're 22-year-old slacker guys working in this suburban strip mall in the mid-90s. So we can definitely find a lot of their behavior a little icky or just a little inappropriate or crude, but it probably fits the time and the place and the character type. So it might just be another facet of Smith's realism. But a lot of viewers kind of thought that by the end, Dante had had some kind of revelation, or he had sort of been made to see the error of his ways. I don't know. Meanwhile, Caitlin's had a very traumatic experience, and she's largely forgotten. She's off screen, by the end, and Dante does mention that he's going to go and visit her in the hospital, but I don't know. You guys can just kind of sort out the relationship aspects, the sex talk, and of course the treatment of the women characters who obviously have smaller roles. I would say the real love story here on display, if there is one, is between Dante and Randall. That's the most important relationship in the film, and I do think Smith kind of makes that explicit over the course of the film. So there's a lot of stuff we can sort of examine when it comes to screenplay, but just sort of give your own thoughts on Smith's dialogue, which is probably what he's best known for. Is it witty? Is it funny? Do we like the pop culture references? Does that stuff still land today? Or does it feel dated? Does it not feel particularly funny to us in our present moment? So again, if we're thinking about the plot, it's very loose, but a lot of people have pointed out, and Smith's talked about this, that the film is kind of, again, loosely based on the Inferno by Dante. That's largely where we get, our name for the protagonist. And there was the 9 levels of hell from that classic work of literature are supposed to kind of be recreated here. So we have like the 9 sort of episodes, the 9 little titles that sort of represent the 9 stages of hell as Dante continues through this torturous day. I don't think Smith is using the Inferno for a whole lot beyond just that basic conceit, that basic sort of structural idea. So, but there is a structure, there is a logic to the plot, and again, that self-contained day in the life approach to the screenplay is sort of accommodating to a low budget. And they didn't need a lot of locations. They didn't need a large cast, and they were able to make this on the cheap. But just if we're thinking before we move on entirely, if we're kind of going back to visuals, there are 2 sort of significant moments just in terms of what we see from the camera work. We see 2 sort of extended, continuous shots with no cuts and no significant movement. The first one is when Dante and Caitlin are talking. So I think it's the first time we see her on camera, and she comes into the store and she and Dante have a pretty lengthy conversation. And again, this is Smith's wheelhouse, just letting his characters talk. Something that Tarantino is also kind of renowned for. But there's a lot more happening typically in Tarantino's movies. I find that scene to be a little bit stiff, but that's about a 5-minute continuous shot with no cuts. And it's just sort of a standard medium shot, a 2-shot, meaning they're both in the shot. We don't see their entire bodies, I don't think, like maybe from the waist up. And they're just talking. And then, interestingly, and this is probably not an accident, later in the film, I think near the very end, after they've had their fight, and Randall and it's when Dante and Randall are just sort of talking in the store. I think they've already trashed the store and they're sitting in the aisle, but I might be a little bit too late. But it's a conversation between the two of them, which is almost the exact same length, another roughly 5-minute continuous shot with no cuts, and this time it's Dante and Randall just sitting there talking. So kind of, parallel scenes perhaps, both featuring extended dialogue, but also a lot of characterization, learning about the characters, learning about their inner states. So there's a lot of value there, but we see a similar sort of visual approach taken. But for the most part, like I said, the visual style kind of unobstructive, non-intrusive, not terribly noticeable, not terribly distinct. And some critics will say even now, Smith's visual style as a filmmaker is really nothing to write home about. He probably has evolved since '94. This was his first film after all, but still probably a more talented writer than he is a visually minded director. And that's an opinion, but a widely held one. Yeah, let's see what else. Oh, well, I wanted to mention the cast a little bit because we can talk about some of these actors. Again, a lot of non-professional actors, none of whom really went on to become big stars in his later films, beginning with Mallrats and obviously with Chasing Amy. Smith would begin to cast Ben Affleck and later Matt Damon and some other really well-known actors as his visibility increased and his fame grew. But here, at the beginning of his career, it's basically people he knew, friends of his, like Jason Mewes, who plays Jay, I think was like a childhood friend of his. They grew up together, went to high school together. He doesn't necessarily know everybody in the cast, but they're all sort of from that same neck of the woods. A lot of mutual acquaintances. Brian O'Halloran, who plays Dante, and Jeff Anderson, who plays Randall, they would both go on to appear in some other Kevin Smith films, the sequels to Clerks. They were in Jay and Silent Bob Strikes Back. I think they had cameos in Chasing Amy and some other movies of Smith's as well, but neither has become, household names or particularly famous in their own right. O'Halloran mostly became a stage actor in New York City, which is kind of interesting. He didn't really pursue much of a movie or TV career. And Anderson, who actually got lauded for his portrayal when the movie first came out, he was sort of thought of as the heart and soul of the film in a lot of ways, and one of the funniest characters. Again, we can decide if we agree. I find myself not liking Randall as much as I used to. But Anderson's portrayal was, I think, pretty good. But he never really did a whole lot else. He did appear in some other movies. Again, he appeared in some future Kevin Smith movies like Zack and Miri Make a Porno. He plays the cameraman in that film. But not a particularly noteworthy career. And Marilyn Gigliotti, who plays Veronica, she actually became a makeup artist in Hollywood and worked on some other movies as a makeup artist, occasionally acted, but not very much. And the actress who plays Caitlin pretty much left acting altogether. So not the most star-studded cast, certainly. Maybe the biggest star out of the bunch was Mewes, Jason Mewes, who plays Jay, because that was obviously a very popular character, and he would, along with Silent Bob, he would be featured a lot more prominently in future Smith movies. He has a pretty small role here, but he is, to me, still one of the more funny parts of the film, one of the more well-written characters. And again, he's largely playing sort of a version of himself, sort of a suburban drug dealer, a little bit of a lowlife, but just sort of a zany, wacky guy. And again, a lot of us at that point in time, if we didn't know somebody just like that, we knew somebody a little bit like that. Like some guy on our school bus, some guy in the neighborhood, one of those guys we would see out in front of the 7-Eleven smoking cigarettes, kind of put us in mind of Jay. And the kind of character that was being portrayed there. So he became pretty well known, appeared in a lot of other Smith films, but then had a pretty long battle with substance abuse and was kind of troubled for a while, but I think he's doing fine now. A lot of these guys became a part of this extended universe that Smith created called the View Askew universe. That's the name of Smith's production company, View Askew, which he founded with Scott Mosier, a former friend from film school, and Mosier appears in Clerks. He's the angry customer who interrupts the hockey game because he wants to buy cigarettes. And so Mosier served as, I think, one of the sound technicians on the film. He wore a couple of different hats. So I think he worked on sound. He might have helped with the editing. I think he put some money up for the film as well. And he's a longtime friend of Smith's. They met in film school and had a deal that whoever finished a script first, the other person would help get that movie made. So Smith finished first, and Mosier came to help him with Clerks. So they founded their own production company, View Askew, and they produced this film, again, on a shoestring budget. Smith, maxed out credit cards. He took some kind of insurance settlement money that he had gotten. He took some money that I think had been put aside for college, maybe by his parents, and he used all of that to help finance the film. And then the film was purchased by Miramax and distributed by Miramax. So, like I said, they did not give it a very wide theatrical release, but it did it made a lot of money through home video. So it was made for $27,000, and it ended up grossing over $3 million, despite that limited theatrical release. Another aspect of the small budget that I forgot to mention is this film is shot on 16 millimeter film. And that might not mean much to us, but the standard film stock that they would use for most motion pictures would be 35 millimeter. But 16 millimeter is cheaper. So a lot like the decision to use black and white, it was, made for budgetary reasons. But it just gives the film, again, sort of a gritty, realistic, very anti-glamour kind of appearance, which worked for the subject matter. It worked for the milieu that Smith was trying to capture. Of course, later he would have a lot more money to work with, and his films would certainly feature better production quality. But again, maybe the low budget's part of the charm here. We can decide on that as well. And as far as when I was talking about Smith's career, I just want to end with this, because I would make the argument, and it's up for debate, but I would make the argument that Smith hasn't really had a lot of hits in this century. Now, he's done a lot of other things. He's, of course, enormously successful on the strength of Clerks, Mallrats, Chasing Amy, and Dogma. But again, all of those movies came out in the 90s. Dogma being the last one, it came out in 99. So in the 2000s, I think in 2001, he comes out with Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, which was the last time I remember seeing a Kevin Smith film in theaters. I was, I think, a senior in high school that year. And it's, kind of going back to the intellectual property. We see that all the time now. Pretty funny movie, but goofy, not a whole lot of substance. And then he kind of moves more towards the mainstream a couple of years later with Jersey Girl, which I believe had Ben Affleck in it. And then he makes some other sort of, middle of the road, kind of middle brow movies. I don't know, some other comedies. Like Zack and Miri Make a Porno with Seth Rogen and Elizabeth Banks. That comes out, I think, in 2008. He does a Clerks sequel. That was not very good, just in my opinion. And more recently, he's turned towards sort of what I think we should call horror comedy, is sort of the genre that he's been working in more recent years. He did a film called Red State back in 2014, which was not really that well received by a lot of critics. He did a film called Tusk, which was also kind of in the horror comedy vein. He had another one, the title escapes me now, I haven't seen it,